Maple Ridge Estates looked like a picture from a real estate magazine. Perfect green lawns stretched out between nearly identical two-story homes with tasteful landscaping and matching mailboxes. I could not believe my luck when I found an affordable house in such a prestigious neighborhood. After 5 years of saving every penny from my accounting job, I finally had my own piece of the American dream. I remember the morning I officially moved in. The early spring sunlight filtered through the kitchen window as I stood drinking coffee, surveying my modest but charming home. The walls needed painting and the appliances were outdated, but it was mine. Every mortgage payment would build my future instead of paying a landlord. I felt a profound sense of accomplishment watching the moving truck unload my belongings. The peace lasted exactly 3 days. I was arranging books on my new shelves when a sharp knock echoed through the house. At my front door stood a woman in her 50s with immaculately styled blonde hair, designer clothing, and the most judgmental expression I had ever seen on a human face. She did not smile when I greeted her. "I am Deborah Harrison, president of the Maple Ridge Homeowners Association," she stated, clipboard pressed against her chest like armor. "Your trash bins are visible from the street. They need to be stored out of sight immediately." I apologized and explained I was still settling in. Her eyes scanned my appearance, taking in my worn jeans and faded t-shirt with obvious disapproval. "We maintain certain standards in Maple Ridge," she continued, her voice clipped and precise. "You will find the complete HOA guidelines in your welcome packet. I suggest you review them thoroughly to avoid violations." Later that week, I met my neighbor Steve while checking my mail. He seemed friendly but nervous. When I mentioned meeting Deborah, he glanced around before leaning closer. "Everyone calls her Karen behind her back," he whispered. "Watch yourself with her. She has been president for 8 years and runs this place like her personal kingdom. The last family in your house moved out because of her." Over the next month, I received notices about my mailbox being the incorrect shade of brown, my grass being half an inch too tall, and unauthorized wind chimes hanging on my porch. Each violation came with a warning and the thinly veiled threat of fines. I tried to comply with every regulation, repainting my mailbox the exact approved shade and removing the wind chimes my mother had given me as a housewarming gift. But something in Karen's demeanor told me compliance would never be enough. During our interactions, she would often pause to look across at her own showcase home directly opposite mine, as if drawing a deliberate comparison. "Some people simply are not suited for communities with standards," she said one afternoon, handing me a notice about improper edging along my flower beds. I watched her walk away, her heels clicking on the sidewalk as she returned to her perfect tutor. Little did either of us know that tucked among the moving boxes in my home office was a folder of inherited documents from my grandfather. Papers that connected me to this neighborhood in ways neither of us could have imagined. Papers that would eventually give me leverage over the very woman determined to drive me out. The certified letters began arriving weekly, each one thicker than the last. My bird feeder was creating unsanitary conditions by attracting vermin. The American flag I hung for Memorial Day was improperly displayed and outside community aesthetic guidelines. My garden hose, visible from the street, was reducing neighborhood property values. Each infraction carried increasingly heavy fines. I noticed something troubling as summer progressed. While Karen scrutinized every inch of my property with microscopic precision, she ignored similar or worse violations from other homeowners. The Petersons 2 doors down had a basketball hoop in their driveway, technically forbidden by the same rules Karen used to cite me. The house on the corner had decorative lawn ornaments far more visible than my bird feeder. Yet only my mailbox remained in violation, despite 3 coats of the approved chestnut brown 5. I photographed these discrepancies, creating a careful record of selective enforcement. My savings account, once a source of pride, dwindled as I paid fine after fine, afraid that non-payment would escalate the situation. I calculated that at the current rate, I would be financially underwater within 6 months. At the quarterly HOA meeting in July, I gathered my courage and evidence. The community center conference room hummed with quiet conversation as 30 homeowners sat in neat rows of folding chairs. Karen presided at the center of a long table flanked by 4 board members, all seemingly hand-selected to support her agenda. Reading glasses hung from a bejeweled chain around her neck, catching the harsh fluorescent light as she called the meeting to order. When the floor opened for resident concerns, I approached the microphone with my folder of evidence. 20 faces turned to watch me. Some looked sympathetic, most simply looked away. I would like to address what appears to be selective enforcement of HOA regulations, I began, my voice steadier than I felt. I have documented numerous instances where violations identical to those I have been cited for are being ignored on other properties. I held up photographs showing the inconsistencies. Karen did not even look at them. She peered at me over her reading glasses, expression one of practiced boredom. "The board has reviewed your previous complaints and found them without merit," she interrupted, her tone dismissive. "Each property is evaluated individually within context. Next item on the agenda." My protests died as she simply talked over me, moving to the next topic while I stood awkwardly at the microphone. The message was clear: I had no voice here. After the meeting, several neighbors avoided eye contact as they hurried to their cars. Only Steve paused beside me in the parking lot. "You did good in there, but it will not make any difference," he said quietly. "She did the same thing to the Gonzalezes before they moved out. Nobody stands up to her because she always finds a way to win. The whole board is afraid of her." "How does one person get so much power?" I asked. Steve shrugged. "She moved here when the development was first built. Her husband was on the original board. When he died, she took his place and never let go. Most people just try to stay off her radar." That night, I found a new violation notice taped to my door, this time for creating a disturbance at an official HOA function. The fine was $300. Over the following weeks, neighbors began to avoid me entirely. I overheard whispers at the community mailboxes, conversations that stopped when I approached. Karen had begun spreading rumors about me being a problem resident with possible financial difficulties. The isolation was almost as painful as the financial strain. I continued complying with every citation, no matter how absurd. I painted, trimmed, removed, and adjusted everything demanded of me, but new violations always appeared. It became clear that the rules themselves were not the point. I was being targeted methodically and deliberately. What I did not tell Steve or anyone else was how desperate my situation had become. Between the mortgage and mounting HOA fines, my savings were nearly depleted. The home that was supposed to represent security and accomplishment was becoming a financial prison. At night, I lay awake wondering how much longer I could hold out against this systematic campaign to drive me away. I just did not understand why she had chosen me as her target. I was quiet, kept to myself, and had tried so hard to follow the rules. What I did not realize then was that sometimes predators do not need a reason beyond perceiving weakness. In Karen's perfectly controlled kingdom, I was simply the newest outsider who needed to be removed. The eviction notice arrived on a rainy Tuesday in September. Water droplets blurred the official letterhead as I stood frozen in my doorway, reading words that could not possibly be real. Notice of eviction, failure to comply with HOA regulations, persistent violations, 30 days to vacate the premises. The room began to spin. My legs gave way as I sank to the floor, the paper trembling violently in my hands. This could not be happening. They could not actually force me out of my own home, could they? Around me lay scattered evidence of my frantic compliance. Receipts for the approved mailbox paint, invoices from the landscaper I had hired to maintain the exact grass height, photographs documenting my conformity to every arbitrary rule. Through my living room window, I caught a glimpse of Karen watching from across the street. She stood at her bay window, arms crossed, face expressionless. Not satisfaction, not anger, just the cold neutrality of someone who never doubted the outcome. That afternoon, I called every affordable lawyer in the county. The third one actually specialized in HOA disputes and agreed to a consultation. His office smelled of old coffee and dusty law books. "Can they really evict me from a home I own?" I asked, voice cracking. He adjusted his glasses, reviewing the stack of violation notices I had brought. "Unfortunately, when you purchased your home, you signed a covenant agreeing to abide by HOA regulations. These documents typically include enforcement mechanisms up to and including forced sale of the property. But these violations are completely fabricated, I protested, or they are selectively enforced against only me. Proving selective enforcement requires extensive documentation and testimony from other homeowners. He explained, based on what you have told me about this HOA president, I doubt your neighbors would risk becoming targets themselves by testifying. What would it cost to fight this? I asked. His hesitation told me everything. A case like this would start around $10,000 in legal fees. With appeals and delays, it could easily reach $20,000 or more with no guarantee of success. $10,000. I did not have even half that amount left. I drove home in a daze, rain matching the tears streaming down my face. Everything I had worked for was slipping away. My home, my security, my future. That evening my phone rang. It was Emily, a former coworker I had kept in touch with. She called just to check in, but hearing the devastation in my voice, she insisted on coming over. There has to be something they missed, Emily said after I explained everything. She worked in title insurance and understood property matters. Sometimes these power-hungry types have skeletons buried in the paperwork. Have you researched the property records for the development? What would I even be looking for? I asked. Anything unusual. Easement issues, covenant restrictions, transfer histories. Most county records are digitized now. Start digging. After Emily left, I pulled out my laptop. The county records office had an online portal, and I began searching, though I barely knew what I was looking for. Property deeds, plat maps, development plans. Hours passed as I clicked through document after document. The clock read 2:17 a.m. when something caught my attention. A transfer document from 15 years ago referenced my address as part of a larger parcel originally owned by Riverside Development Corporation. Something about the name tickled my memory. I searched my email for any mention of it and found nothing. Then I remembered the box of my grandfather's papers I had inherited after his death. Digging through the storage closet, I found the dusty cardboard box and began rifling through old folders. My grandfather had been a small-time real estate investor, mostly apartment buildings and a few commercial properties. Nothing notable or particularly profitable. Near the bottom of the box, I found it. Stock certificates in Riverside Development Corporation transferred to me after his death. I had dismissed them as worthless papers from a defunct company. Heart racing, I returned to my computer, searching specifically for this corporation. The digital paper trail began to emerge. Riverside had developed the original land where Maple Ridge now stood. Through a complex series of transactions in the 1980s, they had sold the development rights but retained certain mineral and easement rights to a 6-property section, including, unbelievably, the exact plot where Corinne's showcase Tudor home now stood. I stared at the screen, documents connecting in ways that seemed impossible. Through some bizarre legal oversight, these specific rights had never been properly transferred during subsequent property sales. And as the inheritor of my grandfather's shares, I now held legal interest in the very foundation beneath Corinne's perfect home. My heart pounded against my ribs as the implications became clear. The woman trying to evict me from my home had no idea that I controlled aspects of her property. The tables had turned in a way neither of us could have imagined. Morning light streamed through the blinds as I spread the documents across my kitchen table for the 5th time, still struggling to believe what they revealed. Sleep had been impossible after my discovery. Instead, I had spent the night printing documents from the county portal and organizing the paperwork from my grandfather's box. The story the papers told was remarkable. In 1982, my grandfather and 3 partners formed Riverside Development Corporation to purchase a 100-acre parcel that would eventually become Maple Ridge Estates. They sold the development rights to a builder, but structured the deal to retain mineral rights and certain easements across specific sections of the property. These retained rights were typical for developers looking to maintain future value in case of resource discoveries or access needs. Normally, these rights would transfer clearly to new owners during property sales or be formally released. But Riverside had gone dormant in the early 1990s when the partners pursued separate ventures. The paperwork showed that the rights for most sections had been properly transferred or released, but due to what appeared to be a clerical error, 6 properties in the northeast corner of the development still had these encumbrances attached to them. Coren's property sat directly in the center of this 6-house cluster. When my grandfather died 10 years ago, his 25% ownership in the dormant Riverside transferred to me. I had ignored it, believing the company held no assets. I could not have been more wrong. I contact Ed Marcus Bailey, a real estate attorney whose name I found through an online search. His earliest available appointment was 3 days away, days I spent alternating between hope and doubt. Perhaps I was misreading the documents. Perhaps these rights had expired or been nullified by some other means. Marcus's office occupied the top floor of a renovated Victorian in the historic district. Unlike the previous lawyer, his space conveyed success and competence. I watched nervously as he reviewed the documents, occasionally nodding or making notes. After nearly an hour, he closed his leather portfolio and looked up. "This is unusual," he said, leaning back in his chair. "These oversight rights were never exercised by your grandfather's company, but they are still legally valid." "What exactly does that mean?" I asked, barely daring to hope. "Based on these documents, you cannot evict her or claim ownership of her home," he explained. "But you do have legal grounds to challenge certain aspects of her property use and access. The easement rights specifically give you authority over driveway placement, utility access, and certain types of structural modifications. Additionally, the mineral rights, while unlikely to have actual value in a residential area, create what we call a cloud on title that would complicate any future sale or refinancing of her property." My mind raced as I processed this information, so I have leverage. Marcus nodded slowly. Substantial leverage, especially if she ever wants to sell her home or make significant modifications. These encumbrances would need to be cleared, which would require your cooperation. And my eviction notice. That becomes a bargaining chip. I would need to review the HOA documents more thoroughly, but this discovery significantly strengthens your position. I scheduled a follow-up appointment for the following week and left his office with copies of everything organized in a leather portfolio similar to his. On the drive home, emotions flooded through me in waves: relief that I might save my home, satisfaction at finding a way to fight back, and something else, something I had not felt in months: hope. That evening I stood at my kitchen window, looking across at Coren's perfect Tudor house with its manicured lawn and tasteful landscaping. For weeks, I had felt like a drowning person, desperate for air as she pushed me deeper underwater. Now, suddenly, I could breathe again. I traced my finger along the property line drawing, remembering every humiliating interaction, every condescending smile, every financial penalty. Tomorrow, I would visit Coren, not as a rule breaker or victim, but as someone with power to affect her perfect world. The tables had turned in a way neither of us could have anticipated. As the sunset cast long shadows across our facing properties, I made my decision. It was time to confront the woman who had made it her mission to destroy my life, armed with knowledge that would change everything between us. Coren's Tudor home loomed before me, its perfect landscaping and ornate facade the physical embodiment of her superiority complex. Elegant stone paths wound through precision-trimmed shrubs, not a flower petal dared fall out of place. The brass fixtures gleamed in the afternoon sunlight as if polished that morning. I checked my appearance one last time in my car mirror. I had deliberately dressed in business attire: charcoal slacks, blue button-down shirt, polished shoes. Not my usual weekend wear, but today was different. Today I needed to project authority. The leather portfolio containing my documentation felt heavy under my arm, weighted with its power to change everything. My hands no longer shook as I pressed the doorbell, its melodic chime echoing inside. For the first time in months, I stood straight-backed, unafraid. The door swung open to reveal Coren in tennis whites, clearly interrupted from her Saturday activities. Her practiced smile vanished instantly upon recognizing me, replaced by thinly veiled contempt. "If this is about the eviction notice, my decision is final," she said, already moving to close the door. "Any further communication should go through the HOA attorney." I placed my hand against the door, preventing its closure. "I think you will want to hear about your property's ownership structure," I replied, my voice steadier than it had ever been in her presence. "It concerns some irregularities that might interest you." Something in my tone must have registered. Her eyes narrowed slightly, but she stepped back, allowing me entry into her immaculate home. The interior was exactly as I had imagined. Crown molding, hardwood floors, and furniture that looked straight from a design magazine. Family portraits in matching frames lined one wall. Alongside them hung framed certificates and awards, several bearing the HOA logo, a shrine to her own authority. "You have 5 minutes," she said, leading me to her formal living room, but not offering me a seat. I remained standing, opening my portfolio deliberately. "Are you familiar with Riverside Development Corporation?" Her expression revealed nothing. "The original developers, what about them?" "I recently discovered something interesting about the original property transactions," I continued, removing the first document and placing it on her glass coffee table, "specifically regarding the mineral and easement rights for this section of the development." "That is ancient history," she dismissed, not touching the paper. "Those rights would have transferred decades ago." I laid down another document. "Actually, no. Due to what appears to be a clerical oversight, certain rights to 6 properties in this section were never properly transferred or released, including yours." Her dismissive scoffs gave way to furrowed concentration as I methodically presented document after document. I could see the precise moment her confidence began to crack. She picked up the county records, scanning them with increasing agitation. "This is ridiculous," she said, but reached for her reading glasses to examine the papers more closely. When I placed the final document before her, the legal opinion confirming my rights as the inheritor of my grandfather's interest in Riverside, color drained from her face. "This is absurd," she whispered. "My property is fully paid for." "The property itself, yes," I agreed calmly, "but not all the rights associated with it. Your title has what legal experts call a cloud on it because my grandfather's company, which I now partly own, still holds certain rights to the land beneath your house." I explained exactly what powers I now had regarding her property access, modification rights, and title constraints. With each point, her expression shifted from disbelief to alarmed understanding. "You cannot do this to me," she said, her voice barely audible. "I never wanted this fight, Karen," I replied, gathering my documents with deliberate slowness. "You brought it to my doorstep with fabricated violations and an unjustified eviction. Now you have 24 hours to retract the eviction notice and address the board about your misconduct, or I will exercise every legal right I have regarding your property." She followed me toward the front door, her demeanor transformed. "Be reasonable," she said, her tone attempting to regain control. "Perhaps we could discuss a compromise." I turned to face her. "The same compromise you offered me, the same understanding you showed when I tried to comply with every arbitrary rule. You have built your reputation on driving people out of their homes because they do not fit your vision of this community." "The rules exist for a reason," she insisted, but the familiar authority had drained from her voice. "Property values." "This is not about property values," I interrupted. "This is about power, your power, which you have abused for years. Now the power has shifted." Her facade cracked completely. "What do you want?" "The eviction retracted by tomorrow. A full accounting to the HOA board of every selective enforcement action you have taken against me. Your resignation as board president within 30 days. And a complete review and revision of how regulations are enforced in Maple Ridge." "That is everything I have built," she protested, desperation creeping into her voice. "Yes," I agreed simply, "just as you were willing to take everything I built." As I walked down her perfect cobblestone path, her voice called after me. not commanding now but pleading for more time for a private resolution. For the first time since moving to Maple Ridge, my steps felt light, unburdened by the weight of constant anxiety. I did not look back as I returned to my car. The tables had turned so completely that the woman who had once looked at me with contempt was now watching me with fear. The power to destroy was in my hands now. The question that remained was what kind of power I would choose to wield. I should have known Karen would not surrender her kingdom without a fight. The emergency HOA meeting she called 3 days later was nothing short of character assassination. From my seat in the back row, I watched as she weaved a narrative portraying me as a vindictive troublemaker threatening the community's stability. This individual has discovered an obscure technical issue and is attempting to extort me, and by extension, our entire association, Karen declared to the packed room, never once meeting my eyes. Her voice carried the practiced authority of someone accustomed to being believed without question. Several board members nodded along, their faces masks of concerned citizenship hiding years of complicity. The audience of homeowners shifted uncomfortably, glancing between Karen and me, clearly uncertain about this unexpected conflict in their usually predictable community. The following days brought certified letters from her attorney challenging the validity of my claims. Legal language questioned the inheritance transfer, the continuing validity of the easement rights, and even threatened countersuits for harassment. The documents bore the letterhead of Harrison, Weber, and Phillips, one of the most expensive firms in the county. Neighbors who had begun to greet me again after seeing Karen's power challenged now returned to avoidance. Someone left an anonymous note in my mailbox suggesting I stop causing trouble and move somewhere more suitable. The isolation returned, heavier than before. Doubt crept in during sleepless nights. Perhaps I had overplayed my hand against someone with far more resources and connections than I possessed. Karen had lived here for decades, building alliances and accumulating influence. I was still the outsider, regardless of what documents I had discovered. Marcus, my attorney, remained confident in our legal position but warned me that litigation could stretch for years. These types of property disputes can become extremely complex, he cautioned during our phone call. She has resources and community standing. Are you prepared for a protracted battle? The turning point came unexpectedly when Elaine, the quiet widow from 3 doors down, appeared at my doorstep one evening. She clutched a large manila envelope to her chest, glancing nervously over her shoulder before speaking. "May I come in?" she asked, voice barely above a whisper. Once inside, she placed the envelope on my coffee table. "I have documented every inconsistent enforcement decision for 5 years," she explained, revealing a stack of meticulously handwritten notes, photographs, and copies of HOA correspondence. "And I am not the only one." Elaine had lost her garden shed after Karen claimed it violated setback requirements, despite identical sheds being permitted on properties owned by Karen's friends. The shed had contained gardening tools that had belonged to Elaine's late husband. "Why are you helping me?" I asked. Her eyes, magnified behind thick glasses, held years of quiet resentment. "Because someone finally has the power to stand up to her, and you should know you are not alone." One by one, neighbors who had suffered under Karen's selective tyranny contacted me privately. The Garcias, whose request for a backyard play structure had been denied, while a nearly identical one was approved for a board member's children. Mr. Cooper, whose medical accommodation request was rejected without consideration. Each had stories of arbitrary enforcement and personal vendettas disguised as rule compliance. When Karen's attorney demanded a formal hearing before the full HOA board to resolve outstanding disputes, I arrived not alone, but with 7 neighbors and documentation of 18 separate instances where HOA rules were enforced inequitably under Karen's leadership. The hearing was held in the community center's main room. Karen sat with her attorney and 3 board members at a long table at the front, projecting confidence. That confidence visibly faltered when she saw not just me, but a line of neighbors filing in behind me. "This hearing is to address specific claims regarding property rights," her attorney began, attempting to limit the scope of discussion. "The claims and the pattern of selective enforcement are inseparable," I responded, distributing copies of our documentation to each board member. For the next 2 hours, neighbor after neighbor stood to describe their experiences. With each testimony, Karen's posture grew more rigid, her expression more strained. The board members exchanged increasingly uncomfortable glances as the pattern became undeniable. The balance shifted perceptibly in that wood-paneled room as decades of carefully hidden abuses came to light, strengthening my position beyond what property rights alone could accomplish. This was no longer about just me and Karen. It had become about the community finding its voice against years of petty tyranny. The community center buzzed with unprecedented attendance for what everyone knew would be a pivotal HOA meeting. Residents who had never participated in neighborhood governance filled every chair, lined the walls, and spilled into the hallway. The energy in the room crackled with anticipation and long-suppressed frustration finally finding an outlet. Karen sat rigidly at the center table, her usual board allies conspicuously distancing themselves physically and symbolically. The evidence of her selective enforcement practices filled 3 presentation boards set up at the front of the room. Photographs, letters, and testimony had been organized chronologically, showing a clear pattern of abuse spanning years. The meeting opened with a review of the property rights issue between Karen and me, presented by a neutral attorney hired by the board. When he confirmed the validity of my claims, murmurs rippled rough the crowd, but it was the systematic presentation of enforcement disparities that truly shifted the atmosphere. When the board vice president finally called for Karen's resignation, the room fell silent. All eyes turned to the woman who had ruled this community with arbitrary authority for so long. Her knuckles white against the tabletop, Karen made her final stand, a speech about property values and community standards that fell flat against the documented reality of her abuses. Her voice, once so commanding, now sounded thin and desperate. "Everything I have done has been to maintain the quality and desirability of our neighborhood," she insisted. "Standards require enforcement. Rules must have consequences." From the back, Elaine's soft voice carried surprisingly well. Rules should apply to everyone equally. The vote for new leadership was unanimous with 1 abstention, Karen herself. In the negotiated agreement finalized the following week, the eviction notice against me was permanently withdrawn. I formally restructured the property rights regarding Karen's home to remove the cloud over her title, contingent upon her resignation, and a complete overhaul of HOA enforcement procedures. The board was expanded to include more diverse representation from all sections of the neighborhood. A new transparent process for reporting and addressing violations was implemented, requiring photographic evidence and consistent application across all properties. Most importantly, an appeals process was established that allowed homeowners to challenge decisions with neutral third-party review. 3 months later, under new leadership, neighbors gathered for the first community picnic in 5 years. People mingled across social boundaries previously enforced through Karen's selective approval. Children played between yards, no longer divided by invisible lines of conformity. From my porch, I watched the transformation with a sense of quiet satisfaction. I had used my unexpected power not to destroy, but to rebuild something better. The papers granting Karen clear title to her property were among the first documents signed by the new HOA board. She still lives in her Tudor home, nodding stiffly when we pass on the street. The folder of documents remains in my office drawer, a reminder that justice sometimes arrives in unexpected forms, and that communities belong to those who live in them, not those who rule them. Sometimes power comes not from controlling others, but from having the courage to challenge those who do. In standing up for myself, I had helped others find their voices too.